there's another aspect of this, and that is that Roosevelt was simply so good at the role of being president. When he said to Orson Welles, "You and I are the best actors in America," he understood that he was acting this role. And the way he acted it was through set speeches. He gave lots of speeches. Through press conferences. Roosevelt held more press conferences than any president before or after, some 954 press conferences in the 12 years of his presidency. He met with the press twice a week. That was the normal rule. And sometimes, in addition to that, on extraordinary occasions. And every press conference was an improvisational performance. Roosevelt roughly knew what he wanted to talk about, but he essentially held court. He came on stage in the Oval Office of the White House when he was in Washington, sometimes at Hyde Park in the family home there, or when he was traveling to various other places. And the way it worked was he would bring the reporters into his office. Unlike previous presidents, Herbert Hoover, his predecessor, had insisted on questions being submitted in writing, because that way he could limit the questions he wanted to answer. If he didn't want to answer a particular question, he would just shuffle that to the bottom. And he would have a chance to think over what he was saying. Because presidents know that what they say can change stock markets, can change the fate of history. And if they misspeak, then it can cause a great furor, and the fate of America can be put at risk. And this is why presidents who are not good at this try to resist news conferences. Or they'll plant questions, or they'll ask particular reporters that they know will ask friendly questions. So it's the relatively rare president who is comfortable in this kind of venue. Most presidents, when they give nowadays you have to give press conferences. Some presidents give more press conferences. Clinton had press conferences much more often than George W. Bush. But it's something that they often do kind of reluctantly, because they realize the high-stakes game they're playing. Roosevelt was playing for equally high stakes, in fact, arguably much higher stakes, because the economy was far more fragile during the Great Depression. And for the 6 years from 1939 to 1945, world order, world peace, the fate of humanity was at stake. But time after time, twice a week, more than 900 times, he went through this performance. And he was absolutely brilliant at it. He could stage manage the performance. He sat behind his desk, and he had the reporters come in. They often crowded into this small space. He deliberately had them in his own office, not in a particular separate meeting room. It was on his turf. They knew that they were intruding on his space. They were his guests. He did this deliberately because he knew that he could gain a psychological edge over them. They had to act politely because they were his guests in his house, in his office. He let them crowd closely around. He liked the idea that they were crowded because it created a kind of intimate atmosphere. And they would feel as though they were part of almost this conspiracy. He would tell them some things off the record. He would tell them certain things for background. And they weren't supposed to report this. And he didn't make a big issue of it, but if they did report it, if they said something they weren't supposed to say, they'd lose their pass to get into the next press conference. And this was the worst thing that could happen to a reporter. It often is for a White House correspondent, but for Roosevelt's twice weekly news conferences were the best show in town. And nobody wanted to miss it because he would joke with the reporters. One of the striking things, you can read the transcripts of all the press conferences, and it is amazing how many times there is square brackets, laughter, square brackets, more laughter, square brackets, still more laughter. The press conferences were not recorded, unlike some of Roosevelt's other performances. They were not recorded, and so we don't know exactly how it sounded, how it worked. But a variety of reporters have talked about it, and they, to a person, say that it was the most fun time they've ever had covering the White House. And Roosevelt knew just how far to tip his hand to intrigue the reporters, to entice them in, and then to withhold information, partly to maintain his sort of psychological advantage over the reporters, so I know more than you do, partly because he realized if he spoke too much it would spook the stock market, or it caused some speculators to make a bunch of money they shouldn't be making, or it would warn of some offensive during the World War. This kind of performance should have worn anybody out. It would have worn anybody out to do this time and time again for 12 years. But Roosevelt seemed to thrive on it. He seemed to come more alive during these press conferences than in just about anything else he did. With one other thing. And here's where I'm going to get to another crucial aspect of Franklin Roosevelt's performance as president. And that is his use of the predominant medium of his day. I said earlier that the presidency really changed in the 20th century, in the age of mass communication. You can see the change begin with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president of the age of cheap newspapers. The penny press developed in the 1890s. And Theodore Roosevelt understood how to deal with newspaper reporters. He understood the timing of newspaper reporting. He understood the distinction between morning newspapers and evening newspapers, and how you could get certain things into the afternoon papers that wouldn't go to the morning papers and vice versa. He knew that if you wanted to get bad news out, you'd give it on a Friday afternoon, because then it wouldn't make the major papers until Monday morning, and people would have had something to forget about in the meantime. Franklin Roosevelt took advantage of the new medium of his day, radio. And radio is, I would argue, is the most intimate of the mass communications mediums. Because Roosevelt was able to speak to the American people by the millions, but also one by one. In the sense that people listening in their homes could listen to Franklin Roosevelt and imagine that he was speaking to them one by one. Now, in this day of the internet, you can listen to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. These fireside chats were his radio addresses to the American people. They took place about 3 or 4 times a year. Presidents today, President Clinton, President Bush, have given and do give weekly radio addresses. And nobody listens to them. Have any of you ever heard one of the president's weekly radio addresses? Nobody listens to them because they happen every week. And you know that what he's saying on the radio is not going to be different than what he said on television. So they're really beside the point. And they make it difficult to recapture how important Roosevelt's fireside chats were. In the first place, he did these very rarely, just on really big occasions, a couple times a year. Secondly, this was the only way you could hear the president in real time. There was no television. And so when Roosevelt gave one of the fireside chats, the nation stopped. And they listened, and they paid attention. And Roosevelt had this voice. He had a command of the lexicon and the style of delivery of radio that made him exceedingly effective. And it was another aspect of this performance. Was it insincere? Not at all. The thing that made it work so well is he believed what he was saying, but he also understood that it was a performance. If he performed well, then he had a much better chance of accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish. If he didn't perform very well, then he probably wouldn't. Herbert Hoover occasionally gave radio addresses, but Herbert Hoover didn't understand the use of the medium. He didn't have the personality. He didn't have this sense that what he was doing while giving this performance was as important as anything else that he was doing as president. I guess the moral of the story for Franklin Roosevelt and for the great presidents as performers is they understand that the performance is as important as anything else they do as president. The performance is as important as the policy itself. Herbert Hoover was brilliant on policy. He could analyze policy. He was as smart as anybody ever occupied the White House. But he underestimated the importance of the role of the president. He couldn't connect emotionally with the American people. Franklin Roosevelt did. In the age of television, the most successful of the performers was Ronald Reagan, has been Ronald Reagan.